Hello, thank you for attending this session of the 5th International Conference of Contemporary Affairs in Architecture and Urbanism. I'm Lester Korzilius. I'm an artist and an architect, and I'll be speaking about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, presenting the unpresentable. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was designed in 1982 by Maya Lin as part of an open international competition. The memorial has 58,000 names of US servicemen who died during the war. First element is place. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is located on the Mall in Washington, D.C., which is a key location in the mental geography of the American psyche. It's additionally a site of active protests, as you can see here in some of these images, which are protests against the Vietnam War, on civil rights, and on women's movements. Additionally, Washington, D.C. was the site of a number of riots, particularly in 1968 with the assassination of Martin Luther King, civil rights activists. And you can see the, excuse me, in this image here in the lower left of the riot police trying to keep order. And so there's a lot of embedded meaning just in Washington, D.C. itself. And so there's a lot of meaning that's brought into it. This alone doesn't account for the impact of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but without this place, it wouldn't have the same meaning. The social context of the Vietnam Memorial is also important. It was a fractious time in America for the Vietnam War. It was certainly the first televised war, and here you can see in an actual battle scene, television crews are out there. And it was brought to the homes of American television every night on the nightly news, and the news magazines, Life and Time and so forth, had images that were really quite shocking for the world and for Americans that were part of the war that you didn't see in previous wars. And so there was a very immediate connection for those that lived through it. The diagram is also, I think, is under acknowledged by other authors on the Vietnam Memorial. The Vietnam Memorial is integrated into the fabric of Washington, D.C., and the L'Enfant plan from 1791, which you see in this image here, is nodal. So Washington, D.C. physically has points of interest of the city where there's given great accord by the diagram of the city. And you can see the mall here and this bit. And you can see in this diagram here where the actual monument is. So Lincoln Memorial, the tidal pool, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Building, the Vietnam Memorial. And what's interesting on this is Foucault, in the French philosopher Foucault, speaking about the Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham, which coincidentally was from about 1791, talked about just the institutionalization of power and how that's structured physically and how that influences behavior. And then Gilles Deleuze, another French philosopher, took that on board with his concept of a diagram, and that he expanded that notion that it's coextensive with the social field. So if you see this competition drawing produced by Maya Lin, which you see the Vietnam Memorial, how it ties in directly to the Lincoln Memorial and to the Washington Monument, which you see here, and then obliquely to the tidal pool. It's a very subtle but very powerful linking with the diagram of Washington, D.C., which I think is, and again, on its own would not be enough to give it the resonance that it does, but when combined with the other thing, it's very, very powerful. Minimalism. The monument has the name of 58,000 servicemen who died, which is compared to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington, which is the national cemetery in the United States for servicemen. The one represents the many, whereas here each individual is identified, and you can identify each name represents a human being, which you can feel when you see it. In minimalist art, there's seriality, whereas the one combines to create the work of art, and there's a resonance in the seriality. But what the Vietnam Memorial brings that, let's say, these works by Sol LeWitt and Carl Andre don't have is that the individual elements, in which case, in the case of the Vietnam Memorial, are human beings, whereas these are industrial components that don't have the same resonance. Phenomenology and time. that, say, in these works of Robert Morris and Richard Serra that you see here, and which the Vietnam Memorial does when you, let's say, exclude the issue of the names, there's a three-way connection between the sculpture, the viewer, and the environment. And this involves the viewer phenomenologically or physically. So there's a kinesthetic experience of the monument, and this introduces temporality into your experience of it. And that's very important, that you have another way of, other than just a cerebral experience, you have a bodily experience of the monument. So the Vietnam Memorial cuts into the ground, which you can see in these competition drawings here, and that's a very important part of the experience. And you walk into the monument along the walls, up and down on either end. And going into the ground is very, very moving, and it's reminiscent of going into a burial chamber, perhaps. The other thing that's very important in the monument is that the names are listed chronologically. So you can see here in this diagram, starting from 1959, then going to 1975. So that the dead are located physically in space. So that's a phenomenological listing of the people, which again wouldn't happen if it were alphabetical. And then it forms a closed loop in here, which again is unusual in it, but creates just a self-standing monument, which is very powerful. The materiality. The memorial is done, as you can see, with polished black granite. So the fact that it's black granite to start with, most monuments are in white marble, or which you can see here in the Lincoln Memorial, for example, in these two images on the bottom. So just by virtue of the material alone, it says that it's anti-monument. And it's also highly reflective, and so that, I think, lessens one's perception of the memorial as a monument, and it tends to highlight the names, and that the reflectivity makes the memorial a carrier of the 58,000 names, and that's very, very powerful. Absence and presence. What's unusual, and perhaps in a way a little bit unfortunate, is that the memorial lists 58,000 names of American servicemen who died, but nowhere is it listed the Vietnamese who suffered in the war. So it's been estimated that 2 million civilians died and 1 million military between the North and South. So that's 3 million people in Vietnam, which is a small country that died. So compared to the American losses, that's more than 50 to 1, which is just phenomenal. But it demonstrates part of the social construct, perhaps, that goes into memorials and monuments, that it's not an objective exercise. So I think, in conclusion, that the Vietnam Memorial is figural, and that it goes to the viewer on a liminal level, and it's really outside of language and thought. And the architect Louis Kahn once made the observation that great buildings need to be, they have to start being immeasurable. They go through measurable means to be constructed and designed, and then they must become immeasurable in the end. And I think the Vietnam Memorial does that. And it's taking elements that are immeasurable, let's say dealing with immortality and death, or mortality and death, and more prosaic elements, let's say the diagram of Washington, D.C., and they combine, but in the end become immeasurable. And I think Jean-Luc Nancy, in talking about the sublime, talks about presentation on the border of the limit. And I think the Vietnam Memorial actually achieves that. And a lot of the experience of it, there's a cerebral experience, but there's also a phenomenological experience that Merleau-Ponty talks about in experiencing through your body. And so there's pre-objective elements and socially constructed elements that combine to form this. And for me, the concept of the dialectical image of Walter Benjamin is quite a useful tool in this. And I think the Vietnam Memorial works because the various elements that we touched on earlier in the talk combine dialectically to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to discuss this further in the Q&A. And thank you very much for your attention.